I'm Todd Gray, and we're doing leadership lessons with Brian Croft. And Brian, it's good to have you on today.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Yeah. So Brian is pastor of Auburndale Baptist Church in Louisville and senior fellow Mathena Center for Church Revitalization at Southern Seminary, but also founder of Practical Shepherding. Has written or co-written over 20 books, which is incredible. And Brian's married to Kara, father of 4 children. They've been married 23 years. And Brian, I think I heard you say you had 2 in college. And did you say the other 2 are in high school?
2 in college, 1 in high school, and 1 in middle school.
Okay. So, wow, a lot of teenagers have been through your home recently.
They're all trying to find their spot at the house to do school. So it's interesting.
Oh my! So you're not at home. You're at a different location today.
That's
One
right.
of our QBC folks, we had a meeting today. He had to go out, or yesterday, he had to go out in his car for the meeting in order to have the Zoom call away from his family. So tell us about Auburndale Church. Give us a little, help us understand your ministry, your context, ministry context.
Yeah. So for about my first 8.5 years of ministry was doing associate pastor work in primarily larger churches in the Louisville area. And then I went to Auburndale Baptist Church 16.5 years ago. And it was a struggling church. It was a dying church, about 30 elderly members on the south end of Louisville, Kentucky. And we knew it was going to be a rough place, but didn't realize how rough it was going to be. 3 different movements to get me fired in the first 5 years of the church. So the first 5 years were brutal. That's a whole nother story that I know we're not talking about today. But God in his kindness, we survived that, and God did a lot. And the ship of the church just turned around year 6. The sweet part of our story is that a lot of those who were after me in those first 5 years, most of those relationships God redeemed. Those people stayed at the church, and they had become some of the dearest people to the church in the church to me. So been there 16.5 years now, and we continue to plug away in that context. So yeah.
So, Brian, you said that 3 efforts to get you have you relieved of your duties. It's not the reason for our meeting, and it's not the primary meeting, but it is about, or the primary reason, but it is about ministry. What are 2 or 3 takeaways that you experienced during that? That's a struggle. 3 efforts to relieve you as pastor. What's something you kind of took away from that experience?
Oh man, well, the first thing, I know we're going to get to some of this, but I learned how important it is to actually take care of yourself to survive in the ministry. So I know we're going to get into some of that in a little bit, but that is definitely a lesson I learned in those first few years. By year 5, I was at the ripe age of 34 years old, and was having heart issues and having physical health things that showed up as a result of all the stress and the struggle from it. So definitely learned that. One of the most important pastoral lessons I ever learned out of that was that I believe strongly in Hebrews 13:17 that I'll give an account for the souls that God's entrusted to me. And one of the most important lessons I learned is that includes the people who don't like me very much. And so I stayed after 5 years, almost left after all that had happened. But I ended up staying because I didn't feel like I could leave. I needed to be faithful to the people that God had entrusted to me, and that there was maybe many reasons why people were against me, and I needed to figure out what that was. And so thankful I stayed, because when I tell my story, I could have left it 5 years and I would have missed so many amazing events and lessons and wisdom that I gained after those years.
Wow. So, Brian, and you also are founder of a ministry called Practical Shepherding. And so tell us a little bit about Practical Shepherding, the purpose of the ministry, and what you're hoping to accomplish there.
Yeah. So when I was pastoring, or I was associate pastor those first 8.5 years at different churches, I went to the pastors of these churches and asked them to mentor me. I knew I was young and needed to be taught ministry. I didn't know what I was doing. And all of them, for different reasons, said no. They didn't feel like it was their responsibility. So I floundered just trying to learn some really hard lessons in ministry and how to do it. When I went to Auburndale, God put a desire in me to want to train young guys for ministry so they didn't have to learn like I did. So I developed this strong conviction that the local church is responsible to train men for the ministry, for pastoral ministry. Seminary theologically trains in a great way, but the local church is actually to train for ministry. And so I still have that deep conviction, and I went to the church with that kind of mentality. And so the Lord started sending some young guys in the early years. I just started pouring into them. I'm dragging them to the hospitals with me. I'm dragging them to the widows' homes and the funerals, and I'm involving them in my sermon prep, just doing the things I thought every pastor did to train guys, for ministry. And I realized that every pastor didn't do those things, and but there's still a huge need for that. So practical shepherding really came out of my local church ministry to just train young guys for the ministry, and through a book that I wrote on hospital visitation, and then a blog that we started about just answering questions about practical ministry. The thing kind of blew up in a few years, and it launched this ministry we called Practical Shepherding. And that was 10 years ago, and the thing has continued to grow to where we have multiple staff and about 25 books in our resources, and we're doing a lot with caring for pastors and developing resources for practical ministry and those kinds of things. It started out as a resources for practical ministry, but it's been interesting that it has evolved to add to that in the care of pastors, just trying to help pastors survive in the ministry with all the struggles and the demands and the pressures that they feel.
And both of those are important. I'm just imagining, I'm remembering how I learned a hospital visitation, how to conduct a business meeting, how to carry out the Lord's Supper, how to prepare a sermon. I learned it by doing it. And just as you said, didn't have a practical mentor, but the guys that you have worked with, they are no doubt better prepared to serve in the local church in all those ways that were mentioned. So one thing that I noticed about your work is that you're a bivocational pastor. You serve as a pastor of a church, but you also are leader over this ministry, founder and leader of this ministry. So there are multiple things in your work with the seminary. So what are some of the challenges, Brian, that bivocational pastors face that guys who are single vocation just may not experience?
Yeah, well, in some ways it's a bit unique because I refer to myself as a bivocational pastor. I really say I have 3 jobs, but they're all ministry related. So I tell people I'm bivocational. I just get to do ministry full time, which is a blessing. There's a lot of overlap with them. But so I find that doing ministry still full time, I'm surrounded by Christians and even pastors in particular. So, I think one of the challenges that bivocational pastors face that full-time pastors don't face is the bivocational pastors. A lot of times they have secular jobs. They're able to be around unbelievers more, but that can also bring challenges to it as well. Pastors who are full-time, I found when I was just a pastor doing that full-time, that it was a challenge to try to get out of the fishbowl. If you're trying to be a pastor and be faithful in that, you're around your people hopefully a lot. You're caring for them. You're in their homes. You're spending time with them. I found I had to make an extra effort to try to do evangelism, to try to just be around unbelievers. And so I realized I had to start to do things that were more intentional to try to do that. So that I would say that's one of the challenges that full-time pastors have that bivocational pastors don't have. And yet you can flip that really easily. There's all kinds of things that are challenges that bivocational pastors have that just regular full-time pastors don't have to face. I think the biggest challenge for bivocational pastors I found is just time. Like, how do you prioritize what you need to do, and then having the ability to be able to let go of the things that need to get done and then just don't have the time to do it. And we have to embrace our limitations as one person. That's one of the biggest challenges I've found bivocational pastors have, is they don't know how to let go of that. They still feel the same pressure that full-time pastors face. They just have less time to try to get it all done. Their people often have the same expectations. They don't think about the fact they have another job. They just want their needs met. So yeah, there's tons of challenges with bivocational pastors because of around time constraints.
There's some guys who figured that scheduling thing out, and in bivocational ministry, they seem to be able to serve kind of at a 30,000 foot level, where they figured out what are the big rocks of their ministry, the things that must get done, and the time they do have, that's where they're spending it, and they're giving everything else over to someone else. That's an important lesson for all of us. Well, we're having this conversation in the midst of this coronavirus, COVID-19 pandemic. Everybody's on a shutdown or a lockdown. We're all in various places. We're doing more Zoom calls. We're learning about Zoom fatigue. We're learning it's good to maybe have a picture that you can put up on your name when you don't feel like you're presentable to a camera. And we're learning about scheduling Zoom meetings. Brian, I had, I think, 4 or 5 yesterday, each of them an hour meeting back to back. And on one of them, I left the camera off and said, look, I'm going to have to eat lunch while we have this meeting. And so I'm eating while y'all are talking, but
Right.
we're still here. So what are some of the challenges that you are hearing from either yourself, your own ministry during this time, or from other pastors that pastors are facing right now?
So I'll share out of just personally trying to be a pastor and wade through all this, and probably in contact with probably a good 300 to 400 pastors every week we're interacting with about what's going on. So I'll speak out of that. One is just what to do with Sunday morning. I think people have figured out, for better or worse, they have figured out what they're going to do for not being able to meet. So whether it's a live stream, whether it's a Zoom call, whatever it is, I would assume by now most churches have found their niche in how they're going to approach this. Though I think that was one of the biggest things people were trying to sort through. And there's a theological component to that. Not just trying to figure out how to best simulate ministering the word and doing what we do on Sundays, but helping our churches realize that this isn't replacing church. This is us trying to get by with the situation we're in. It's better than nothing, but important teaching moments through that. So there's a lot of pastors where all of a sudden having to wrestle through, not just practically, but even from a theological standpoint, I think. The two other areas that I've noticed are pretty weighty for pastors, and that's just how to shepherd the flock well. I've been talking to pastors too long now, these last month. I've stopped referring to the extra free time thing that some people do have. Some people are laid off. Some people, the restrictions it's allowing a lot of people have a lot of time on their hands they didn't have before. I'm finding pastors are just as busy, if not more, because they're still trying to do the same amount of shepherding they were before, and they just got to try to be creative and innovative in how they're doing it. And that is bringing a unique stress and just a lot of pastors feeling overwhelmed. How do I care for my folks? And that we wired ourselves to want to be with them physically, to be able to interact and connect with them and touch them in some way. And we just can't do any of those things. And I find that the pastors are feeling the angst to need to do more, but they don't know what more to do. So I'm saying over and over again to pastors, hey, you're being faithful. Like, make phone calls, set Zoom calls up, get creative. I started from week one. I've done this every week. I'm driving to widows' houses and sitting in the driveway. I call them and say, I'm in your yard. Come out and stand on your porch and talk to me a minute. And they come and stand on the porch, and I'll be 10, 15 feet away from them. I just was reminded don't underestimate how much just in person, just even if you can't touch each other, hearing a real voice that's not through a screen. You're talking about a 90-year-old widow doesn't even have a computer. So it's their only human interaction. So pastors having to try to figure out how to be innovative, and yet it still just it's not the same. So there's like this angst that's created in it. The third is financial just challenges. I've been encouraged that this last month, the first month, the pastors I've been talking to, it sounds like a lot of churches had people faithfully give more than they thought, which was encouraging to me, at least some of the ones I talked to. I do think the fallout's coming, though, in the next couple of months, as jobs have been lost and other things. People who would tithe normally just can't. And so financial shepherding, and then what to do on Sundays. I think Easter Sunday was a really interesting day because there was this pressure to somehow pull off some amazing act online. And I just told guys, just do what you're doing. It's okay. And it's amazing how much just telling pastors, look, just be faithful. Don't compare yourself to everybody else really does seem to help.
The message itself is amazing. It's enough. If it's delivered, it's amazing. And there were folks hearing it this year who probably haven't heard it in a long time.
That's what I've heard too.
One additional thing, Brian, on your list that I think is a stressor for pastors, and our primary topic is pastor self-care today, is the reality of routines. I read recently about routines, that routines allow us to not have to think about what we're doing, that this is something I do at this time every week. And whether it's the sermon preparation or it's the hospital visitation or the phone calls, it's what I do. And all those got turned upside down. And so now pastors we're learning a month ago, I think we're at week 5 today, that they had to learn new skills, use social media more, live streaming or Facebook, but also their routines are just turned upside down. They've had to learn new routines. That's a major stressor for any of us. That happens in a transition, but it's also happening today. So at Auburndale, you've described a little bit about how you're commuting. Man, I love the fact that you drove to the widow's house and talked to her on the front porch. That just, man, that blesses my heart. One of the most challenging things I've heard from pastors, and I'll ask you this: have you all had a death in your church during this quarantine time? Has that happened in your congregation?
Yeah, good question. We haven't had a death, but we had a 91-year-old widow who went to the hospital with COVID 19 symptoms. She had pneumonia when she got to the hospital. Of course, 91 and pneumonia, regardless of the cause, is dangerous. And she had no family. She has no family. She has a friend and a neighbor who's the executor of her will. So nobody could go see her, and that was really a challenge. She ended up not testing negative for the virus, but she's still in the hospital. She's been there a couple of weeks. I haven't been able to go see her, and that's been hard. So, but that's the closest thing. I mean, by God's grace, our folks have been able to stay pretty healthy at this point, personally.
So, Brian, when you think about reopening to in-person services, whenever that day is out in the future, and none of us have any real clear sense of a when, we could all guess. What are some things that are going to be on your mind when you think about having in-person services again? How will things be different?
Yeah, that's the conversations that have been kind of cropping up all this week now that hadn't been there before. I think everybody was trying to get through Easter and then kind of hopeful that things are going to turn here in a few weeks. But I think there's a couple of things I think we have to consider. One is how tightly is everybody connected to one another when you gather. So in our church, we have about 80 members, and we have a sanctuary that holds a little over 300 people. So I kind of joke, like, we can still social distance and all gather together. And so I know everybody's not in that position. In fact, I talked to a couple of pastors who are in other countries yesterday, who they have a little room that their church meets in. It's locked in shoulder to shoulder, and that's a totally different challenge that they have in trying to figure out, because you're going to be all close together. So I think that's the first thing. Is there a way? Let me say this first. I don't think everything's just going to reopen. It's going to be a very gradual thing, and I assume, depending on the state, they're going to say, okay, now gatherings of this size can happen, but keep social distancing and those kind of things. So I think you have to consider, what's the dynamic of the congregation. Do you have a lot of kids that are going to run around and be close and all? I mean, I think I wasn't opposed to drive-in church through this. We just felt like it was going to be hard to try to pull that off for us. And we also thought about whether kids could actually, would they actually manage to stay in cars and all that kind of stuff. So I think you have to consider the dynamic of your congregation. How close will everybody be? I'm probably, when we relaunch, we won't do Sunday school, is one of my guesses, because they're all in small, tight rooms. So if we just have church to come back together, there's more of an open space. So I think we have to think about, they're going to ask us to social distance to a degree, I'm sure. We should assume that as we try to prepare. The other thing I would throw out there is, we have older folks that even when we start gathering, probably will not want to gather or not feel safe doing that. So I'm already trying to think about how to include them. We don't want to not have church just because there is going to be a few people who will not feel safe coming. But I do want to be mindful of how to serve them. And so whether that, the live streaming everybody's been doing, whether you have church and then still provide that maybe for some older folks to be able to be a part of it. I think that's part of the dynamic. Last thing I'll throw out is, then what do you do about the Lord's Supper? Passing plates around and passing. Those are the things I think we're going to have. I mean, the Lord's Supper is one of the things I've missed the most about not being together. But I'm in a camp that I'm not comfortable doing the Lord's Supper if we're not gathered. So that's something I'll really look forward to when we come together. But I don't want it to be a distraction. So I think that's another thing we're going to have to think about.
So the things you're describing, I've heard pastors talk about. They will not collect the offering the same way when they are regathered. One pastor mentioned that they would really emphasize a cleaning crew that would sanitize the pews, et cetera, places where people would be placing their hands. I think a lot of folks are going to be wearing masks to church when that time begins to come back, and the meet and greet time that still exists in a lot of Kentucky Baptist churches will probably take a back seat for at least a good while, and we'll see if it returns. Well, those are all unique challenges. So I'm with Brian Croft, and Brian is the founder of a ministry called Practical Shepherding, as well as pastor of Auburndale Baptist Church. He's written or co-written about 20 books. I have a few of them here, Brian. One of the things I love about several of these books is that they're smaller in size, so I can really feel like I've accomplished something when I read them. But they're all extremely practical, and so the phrase practical shepherding applies. You mentioned in our conversation earlier about evangelism and how that everything seems to pull away from for a bivocational pastor, he may have opportunities that a single vocational pastor does not have. That was my experience as a full-time pastor. I was highly evangelistic, became a believer, 24 years old, living in Indianapolis, Indiana. I'd only been saved for a couple of weeks, and my pastor enrolled me in a witness training course, and he didn't ask if I wanted to be enrolled. He enrolled me. And so I went and learned about sharing my faith. And I thought that's what every Christian does. And so I became very active, and I was a businessman. So I witnessed to my customers as a salesman. And then I became a pastor and thought that that's probably all I would do now would be to share the gospel, and I realized that I hardly ever share the gospel as a pastor. Everything pulled me away from evangelism. So I can appreciate that bivocational pastor who might work in a factory or work in a bank or work as a school teacher who has opportunities. But these books are just highly practical on subjects. You have one here called Gospel-Centered Funerals, Visit the Sick, Pray for the Flock. You have some really good, simple, helpful tips that are just that. They're practical. These are all things that every pastor does to some degree or another, regardless of the size of the church. And one of the things I've appreciated about your writing is the emphasis that you've placed on widows and caring for widows. And even now, you mentioned the 91-year-old lady you mentioned in this book, a 94-year-old, I think, that walked 5 miles a day up until a place where she couldn't walk 5 miles. She could only walk 4 miles a day at that point. So those are just all great, helpful tips. So why did you write this particular book? So this one's The Pastor's Soul, The Call and Care of an Under Shepherd. So this is about the pastor, and it's about pastor self-care. So why this book? And real quickly, you co-author is Jim Sebastio, who in most of these books that you have a co-author. So tell us anything you want to tell us about Jim, and then why this book.
Yeah, so Jim is a big partner in our ministry of Practical Shepherding. He pastors the Reformed Baptist Church of Louisville, planted it about 30 years ago, and he does the podcast with me, and he co-wrote that book with me. And the main reason we wrote that book, so the Practical Shepherding, there's really three core ideas: pastor's soul, the pastor's ministry, and the pastor's family. We believe that those are the three areas that every pastor needs to be cared for, and he needs to be healthy and for him to thrive in his ministry. And if you think about it, if any of those are out of sorts, there's problems that come with that. So my wife co-wrote the family book with me. Jim wrote the soul book, and then the ministry book I wrote. But those are the three core ideas of really all that Practical Shepherding revolves around. The pastor's soul is focused on a pastor needing to be able to take care of himself spiritually, emotionally, physically. So, and there's actually tons of New Testament texts that point to this as part of the pastor's calling. So you take Acts 20, verse 28, where Paul's exhorting the Ephesian pastors there before he leaves. And he says, take heed to yourself and your flock. And that's really a dual calling, I think, for the pastor. And we're great at, we pour ourselves into taking heed to our flock and caring for our flock. But many of us stink at caring for ourselves. In fact, many of us don't think we have the right to, because we're so used to just pouring out for everybody. I talked to all kinds of pastors. I was one of them for a long time that felt like it was selfish for me to take care of myself because I'm supposed to just pour out for everybody. The problem is pastors lead to burnout or really poor decisions, or just a nervous breakdown often comes because they have no idea how to care for themselves. And when you just keep pouring out and you're empty and you don't have anything that fills you up, that's really a dangerous way to live. So the pastor's soul is to, one, just biblically make an argument to say this has to be a priority in your life, or you don't have anything to pour out for other people. And then the other part of the book is to just practically flesh that out, and how does a pastor take care of himself.
So you dedicate the book, and I'm assuming you and Jim dedicate the book to Bill Hughes and Austin Walker. One of those two may be more significant for you, or maybe both of them are. But tell us about the significance of these two men in either your life or you and Jim together.
I appreciate you asking that question, because both of these men I would not have met without Jim. They're longtime mentors of Jim. Austin planted a church. He's British. He planted a church just south of London in a dark town called Crawley, England, 45 years ago, and just retired from that church. He also wrote the Widow's book we wrote that book together in Practical Shepherding. Bill Hughes is a Scottish pastor who retired about 4 or 5 years ago. So both are in. Bill is in his. Both of them are in their 80s, I believe now. But like both of them pastored for 50 years faithfully. Amazing preachers. Like most people never heard of them, but I would rather hear these guys preach any day than some of the biggest celebrity pastors that everybody says they want to hear preach. These guys are amazing to hear preach. They're just faithful men of God, and they had Jim, and my pastoral mentor, died in a car crash with his wife. A drunk driver hit them, and I was devastated by that. And about a year after that happened, Jim introduced me to these two men, and just God's kind providence. And they kind of became mentors to me in that void that I had lost. And they became just very meaningful to me because of that void and because they poured into me. And again, it even goes back to my story, when I wanted to be mentored in my 20s and wasn't mentored. I work with pastors now, but I still have that longing to want to have an older man to pour into me and to invest in me.
Brian, I appreciate you saying that. You said it twice, so I have to bring my own part into it as well. I had the same experience. I became a believer when I was 24 years old, and a friend named Keith Tyner, who was a businessman, discipled me through like an eight week something called Operation Timothy. It was part of Christian Businessmen's Committee. And so we met up on Saturday, memorized some Bible verses. I still remember 1 John 5:13 from the time together. But it was finished, and it was the Bible study that we did together. And because of it, I had a hunger for someone to pick up and keep going. And so I can't tell you the number of people I asked to mentor me or disciple me. And I think most of them really had no idea what I was talking about. They couldn't get there, or they didn't know how to do it. No one had done that for them. But I had the exact same experience that you did. At some point, I realized I'm not going to ask anyone else to do this, but I'm going to do this same thing for other people. And so I started trying to pour into young men what I saw in 2 Timothy 2:2. I came across Dawson Trotman, Navigators, as Dawson Trotman as an example of someone who was doing kind of one-to-one work, and realize as obviously these men have marked your life, and realize that the fastest way to develop leaders is to find a hungry person and just start pouring into them and start spending time with them. And we meaning the collective body of Christian leaders want to try everything else except that one-to-one approach. We think if I can get a group together, if I can get 1,000, if I can get 10,000, if I can get a big number, then we can get it done quickly, mass production style. But man, Jesus showed us how to do it. Paul modeled it as well. Is there anything in particular that you can think of in one way that Bill or Austin, or even the person, I don't think you called the name of the person who was killed in the car accident, something that they said or did that has just marked you for ever since that experience, something in their example or something, a phrase that they gave you that has just stood with you?
Wow, what a great question. Jackson Boyette, by the way, is the man that was killed in the car crash. He was a pastor in Austin, Texas. Oh man, there's so many things. I think the one thing that comes to mind, I remember sitting at breakfast with Bill Hughes, and he looks at me. We were talking about how pastoral ministry, if you do it right, that you die a little bit every day as you do it, but it's a good dying. It's what we're called to do. We spend ourselves. We spend and be spent in the service of a bountiful master, as John Flavel used to say. So Bill, I'll never forget when I was sitting with him and he was explaining this to me. He had some really hard ministry, but he was a really faithful shepherd to people to care for their souls. And he looked at me and he said, he was about in his late 70s when we talked. And he said this to me. He said, Brian, I want to preach till I'm 90 years old. Like I want to preach till I die. He says, but I can't do the pastoral work anymore. And he explained to me how over the course, you're talking like 4 or 5 decades, right, of pastoral work. Over the decades, you give yourselves to these people and they break your heart. You carry burdens with them. You just when you're thinking about the relationship of a pastor to his people and how sweet that is when it's done in that way. He just articulated, he hit a point where he didn't have the emotional capacity to do it anymore. And it was this kind of beautiful moment of him saying 2 things to me that I really heard loudly. Embrace your humanity as a pastor. You can only do this so long, you can only give so much, and that's actually okay. We're not God. We're human beings. We're men. We're broken. We're sinners. We're weak. We need Jesus. We have all these needs, and we can only give ourselves so much. And to hear him just kind of say, like, that's okay. And then he said this to me that always stuck with me. He said, so the goal of an old pastor is a peaceful but broken heart. And that always stuck with me because it's like peaceful, right? Not bitter, not angry, like peaceful. Like I faithfully served my Lord in this role. But if I do this right, I'm going to be an old man with a broken heart because I carried so many burdens for so long. And that was one of the sweetest pictures of pastoral ministry I think I'd ever heard anybody say. And it came from like an 80-year-old Scottish guy. It's kind of where you have to go to hear those things, I think.
Or go find the 80-year-old guy in your own town who's been doing it faithful as well.
No doubt.
I'm just thinking about this whole Scottish reference. I'm thinking there must have been a trip in here, and so it sounds like there was, and so that's a real benefit to get to hear those words with a Scottish accent in the context of being in Scotland. Sure. I can see the impact not only from the
the Scottish accent helps for sure. When you hear wisdom like that from an old guy, and he has a Scottish accent on top of that. Yeah, that's perfect storm. It's gold. Yeah.
So here's a question about how do you discern? You're thinking about pouring yourself into someone else, mentoring another person. How do you recognize a person who really wants to grow versus someone who's asking for this is a pejorative statement, but who's asking seminary questions? You know what a seminary question is? It's a question I don't want an answer. I just want to show everybody how much I know. So how do you kind of discern between the guy that you really can pour into? Because Paul said, find faithful men. Who can teach others also. And Jesus didn't randomly choose those disciples, prayed all night and picked them. So what are 2 or 3 traits of someone that you would want to invest in as a young leader or young pastor?
Yeah, Todd, that's a great question. And you know what, if you would catch me 10 years ago, I probably made more effort with the seminary guy, just hopeful that I could help him see that he needs to focus on other things. And I have since changed. I obviously work with a lot of seminary students, but there's 2 qualities that are so valuable to me in how I choose who I invest in, and it's humility and it's teachability. Yeah. Give me the most gifted guy, but he's young, he's arrogant, and he thinks he knows it all and is not teachable. Like I find myself, my patience is actually wears pretty thin pretty quickly now. That part of that's being burned through the years of feeling like I wasted some time with some folks. That's part of stuff I had to work through. But give me the roughest guy you can find. If he loves Jesus and he loves his word, and he's teachable and he's humble, I mean, I will invest in him all day. He's the guy that nobody sees leadership in, nobody sees gifts in, and I love those guys. Like I will cling to them and invest a ton of time. Because throughout my ministry, those are the guys that when I've invested in, I've seen God raise up some incredible men and women for leadership positions in the church who other people didn't see. But because there was a humility and because there was a teachability within them, they were just sponges and took it all in, and God just used that. So teachability and humility is really big when I'm looking for someone to try to mentor. Not a polishedness and not even gifting for that matter. It really comes down to humility and teachability.
So Dawson Trotman used the acrostic FAT, and so he was looking for a man who was faithful, available, teachable. He
Oh
was
yeah.
faithful. If he said he would show up at 11 o'clock on Tuesday, then he was going to be there at 11 o'clock on Tuesday. He's available. He's probably busy, but he has enough time to grow as a believer and wants to grow. And he's, as you said, teachable. You can't pour into a full cup. There has to be an openness and an emptiness before a person can learn. That's so helpful,
That's
Brian.
great.
And if a guy has that, it's not about whether he's going to become a deacon in a church or an elder or a Sunday school teacher or a pastor of a church. That person just needs to be invested in. So let's talk about pastor soul care and self care, because that's who's going to have to give it. It's going to be care from yourself for yourself. Why do you think pastors neglect that area, even if they're working hard on their family to care for their family and they're working hard on their pastoral ministry? Why is there a neglect of self care?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's two things that I find come back around to this all the time. The first is that there is there's so much to do in the ministry that we just get consumed with all the pressure and demands we feel, the to-do list. So we pour ourselves into that. We know we're supposed to take care of our family. You know, I mean, 1 Timothy 3 makes it a prerequisite. We got to care for our family well. So hopefully we have a conviction to do that. And so we just get bogged down with and overwhelmed, I think, with just so much to do. And we let the pressure and the demands that our people bring into our lives that influence us. We get really wrapped up in wanting to be appreciated. We want people to like us. We fear man, so it motivates this unhealthy drive to just do more than we really have a capacity to do. So the last thing that happens in that context, if we are ate up with trying to please everybody and meet everybody's expectations, last thing we're going to do is care about ourselves. The second thing I see is, I think pastors, I'm going to speak just as a man, as a human being, most of us were not taught to care for ourselves. We were taught to pour out for others. So a lot of us come from broken backgrounds that we have our own just personal issues that cause us to not see ourselves in a loving and caring light. So we, in a sense, we almost don't feel worthy of care. So we don't even receive care from other people. So not only do we not care for ourselves, but a lot of times we have our own, just emotional issues that come from the past, usually, that keep us from being able to receive the care of others. So if you can't receive the care of others, even when they try, and you don't know how to take care of yourself to be able to then make the time to do it, pastors are pouring out and taking nothing in. And now there'll be some things like, hopefully a devotional life and legitimately walking with the Lord, and pastors are doing that. That certainly is a big part of caring for ourselves and being able to keep doing the work. But there's so many other components to that pastors leave out that eventually catches up to everybody.
So, Brian, we're in a time right now where, man, I mean, things are shut down, and so where a guy may have found some meaning and purpose in his ministry, um, in doing the visitation, going to the hospital, standing in the pulpit, preaching to a crowd, shaking hands, feeling the joy that comes when 100 folks walk by and say, good job, or at least they try to say good job, in your sermon. Great message. And that's all stripped away right now. And one of the things you reference in your book is about what self-care causes me to have to look at myself and take an honest evaluation about how I'm doing. So what are some of the signs that maybe I have, as a pastor, as a church leader, that maybe I've neglected caring for myself? So if I'm not caring for my family, it's going to stand out. If I'm watching at all, it's going to stand out in my relationship with my bride and with my children. If I'm not caring for the flock, it's going to stand out. Somebody's going to say something, or I'm just going to lose influence with the congregation. What are some signs that I'm neglecting this third area, this area of self-care?
Yeah, it's good. I would say look for how fatigue shows up in your life. So, I think that when we lose our joy for the work that God's called us to, that is a clear sign for a lot of pastors that we're not taking care of. We're on empty. Todd, I'll speak personally. Maybe this will connect to some who are listening to this. There's two signs for me that I am depleted. Just I've learned as I've tried to be aware of watching for the sign. it's got to be introspective. You got to look at yourself and go, what's going on with me now, and how is the ministry affecting it? When I hit fatigue from the ministry, two things are affected: my joy for the work, because I love what God's called me to do. So when I lose the joy, that's a flag for me. I gotta make note of. The second one, and this one took some work, but this one's really brought some tremendous insight into my own soul: loneliness. I felt loneliness as a sign of fatigue, and that I'm depleted spiritually, emotionally. Um, the reason that caught me off guard is, like, I'm a pastor, right? I'm surrounded by people, and I can say I'm surrounded by people who love and appreciate me, and I feel loved and appreciated. And on top of that, I have people who want to talk to me and want my attention. I remember thinking, what, loneliness? Where in the world did that come from? And what I realized is that the lack of connection, human connection to someone who just wants to love and care for me and doesn't want something from me, was absent in a lot of ways. And I realized that's where the loneliness comes. So part of my own soul care is for me to be able to pour out for people, is I got to recognize that fatigue and go, okay, I actually got to go be with a friend who just wants to be with me, or spend time with this person or that person who doesn't just want something from me. And I find a lot of pastors can relate to that. And so I think it's about, you have to take the time to evaluate not just what's going on with me, but why. And you have to ask those questions, or you can't dig into what's really going on there. I mean, I would have never thought loneliness was an issue for me, but it's a flag now for me. When I can go and get some rest and get away for a little bit and do the things that I know I need to do to refresh and bring life to my soul, the loneliness goes away. It's a really strange thing.
So, Brian, you're referencing know yourself. You know, there was a generation of teachers to pastors who made that important distinction about know the Bible, know the congregation, but you also need to know yourself. And you're identifying two aspects of your own personal makeup that are indicating for you a loss of joy and a presence of loneliness. My guess is for others is there may be some different things. It could be that cynicism starts to rise up in their life. It could be expressed through anger. It may be they become short with people. They just are not showing love. It could be they find themselves drifting off into some bad habits or some bad practices, maybe even in areas of entertainment that they shouldn't be going into, that they start to drift into some of those as well. Yep. I think that's important. You reference Spurgeon quite a bit. You and Jim both do in the book. So talk a little bit about what you discovered from the life of Charles Haddon Spurgeon, this Prince of Preachers, great evangelist, soul winner, teacher of students. What about him and soul care has stood out to you?
So I love Spurgeon, but I love Spurgeon for the reasons a lot of people don't necessarily highlight. Like those couple you highlighted are the things that Spurgeon's known for, which he was a lion of a preacher and an evangelist. And, certainly love those things about Spurgeon. There's two things about Spurgeon's life, though, that I particularly just grew to love about him that doesn't get highlighted as much. Number one is how he genuinely cared for the souls of other people. Mm-hmm. So there's a story about Spurgeon. It's kind of resurfaced in the pandemic, that there was a cholera breakout, that thousands were dying, fleeing the city of London. And Spurgeon, at like 24, 25 years old, he was actually canceling speaking engagements that he had, because he was already everybody knew him as an amazing preacher, even as a young man. He was canceling preaching engagements to go into the city and go care for the people who were dying of this plague. And I love that story of Spurgeon, right? Those are the things that says something about that man in a way that we don't see when you just with other things. The second thing about Spurgeon, this goes to the soul issue, is for Spurgeon to be so used by God and effective and so wise and winsome and powerful in what he did, he had major battles with depression and had no idea why. So there's some of the writing, when you read Spurgeon's writings, when he describes his battle with depression that he had his whole life, is just truly helpful to hear how he wrestles through that. There's a book I'll mention. It's called Spurgeon's Sorrows. Spurgeon's Sorrows. Christian Focus published it. guy named Zach Eswine, he's a really good, solid brother, put this together. Basically, took all of Spurgeon's writings on depression, his battle with depression, and pulled them all together in a book and kind of shaped them together. It's a tremendously helpful read because Spurgeon, like way before his time, right, is diagnosing depression and acknowledging, this is not just a sin issue. There are other things involved here with it. And to think of the mighty Spurgeon, sitting in a corner crying uncontrollably and has no idea why. That Spurgeon had this amazing grasp. He was forced to have a grasp on how a pastor tries to work through those things in his own soul. So just to see somebody like that battle the inner issues like that, I find pastors find tremendous encouragement just to know they're not alone in whatever their struggles are. So Spurgeon is really helpful in that way, and that's one of the things that I love celebrating about him.
When someone can normalize your pain and help understand that I'm sure plumbers have a burnout they experience, and bankers do, and teachers do, and pastors do as well, and it's different, and it's not uncommon, and depression and weeping and great sadness can all accompany that. So we've talked about the importance. So again, with Brian Croft, a practical shepherding pastor of Auburndale Baptist Church, talking about his book, Pastor's Soul. So a great book. Just finished reading it. And so let's talk about the cure, Brian. Let's talk about some habits and practices that a pastor can put in place to address caring for himself. You mentioned 6 in your book, and I love these 6. I love all 6 of them. And so, and the first one is you're not using it as a verb, but it is eating. So go eat some food. You're going to care for yourself. And we're facing some challenges with eating. And you start out this portion of your book with an example that actually comes from the Southern Baptist Convention. Do you want to talk about that example at all, and then talk about food and pastor self-care?
I can, Todd. You're going to open a can of worms with it, but you asked, so no, it's fine.
They're just worms. So
that's right, and we won't eat the worms. So. Yeah, so it was. See, I think it was the SBC in Nashville. So this is probably close to 10 years ago now. But I was there, and there was a debate on the floor about alcohol.
That's not an unimportant debate, not right. An unimportant issue, right?
Right. And so, but it was getting pretty heated. Yep. And there was a young man that stood up and basically testified of taking care of his alcoholic father as a teenager and watched him die. And but brought up the fact, so he basically established his credibility as somebody who's deeply affected by this issue of alcohol. But he said, but the bigger issue I think we need to deal with is how we are dealing with food in our life, and why he was making a statement about that there's certainly weight, obesity and weight issues that can be a cliche even within our denomination. And so what he called out there, I think is just worth talking about in a sense of, and this was true in my own life. I was an athlete my whole life, but I have had to really be mindful of how, not so much what I eat. We talk a lot about that. In this book, I'm really flagging for us, why do we eat? I come from a long line of comfort eaters, so stress eaters, So I make a gross generalization to make a point. I think there's 2 kinds of people in this world. There's people who eat when they're stressed, and there's people who don't eat when they're stressed. Both are unhealthy, by the way. One just is able to maintain weight a little better, usually, if you don't eat when you're stressed. But I have had a long wrestling with using food as a comfort in stress when I'm supposed to go to Jesus for that comfort. And so just flagging, being mindful to eat healthy, that makes us feel better. That actually really matters in what we eat. But I found when it tied to the soul is, why am I eating? And what I eat and how I eat and how much I eat usually reflects on whether I'm using food as a coping mechanism for the stress I'm feeling as a pastor.
And Brian, I really appreciate you pointing that out, and the way you addressed it in the book was helpful. The way you're addressing it here, candidly, is helpful. The exact same battle in my life as well. But the part of your book that was helpful for me was the why question, not the amount of food or the impact that food is having. Those are not unimportant questions either. But the why, and then what to do about it. You also mentioned sleep. as an important self-care practice. And you talk about your own need for 8 hours of sleep and the comparison. We've all heard of Dr. Moeller and folks like him who supposedly live on 3 or 4, 5 hours of sleep a night and read a book every day. And we can compare ourselves to them if we're not careful. I appreciate your help there. And each person understanding how much sleep do you need to function. And that's easy to recognize. It just depends on how you act the next day. If you're not acting well, if you're in a dark place and you're thinking all the time, you might not be getting enough sleep. You mentioned exercise, and I really appreciate the way you address exercise of start with something. You've talked a little bit here about friendship, which is the fourth of the six, but I want to talk about the next one. You list silence and you're combining what Donald Whitney would call silence and solitude. So tell us what you don't mean by that, and then what you do mean by this practice of silence and solitude as a way to provide care for yourself.
Yeah, so I believe the best, if we're talking about self-care, comes by self-awareness. Let's say, put that on the table, that's what we're talking about. We can't know how to care for ourselves if we aren't aware of what is going on in our soul. I find the best way for any human being to avoid knowing what's going on in their soul is to be really busy and let things be really noisy. So I'm convinced that silence and stillness, one is biblical principles found in the Psalms and other places, but silence and stillness is the best way to go before the Lord, and engage in prayer and other things, and to find out what is actually going on. Who are we before God is a really important daily question we got to ask ourselves, and are walking in the grace and the forgiveness he provides. Like that, those are important pieces to the truth of the gospel permeating those aspects of our soul. We run from the pain of our life through noise and busyness. And that's one of the things I did. So I'm an extrovert. So I was convinced for years that the reason I just didn't like to be alone and didn't like silence was because I was an extrovert and I liked people and all these kinds of things. Yeah, that was a cop out. I just fooled myself for years and years. What I realized, and this was through getting some counseling that I had for years, discovered that the pain of my life that I had not dealt with got louder and tormented me in silence. And so I ran from silence because it was such a terrible place to be. And noise and busyness was the way I coped with that. And I find that most of us deal in our own ways in those kinds of things. So what I had to do, as I got some help with this, by the way, there's some things like this that other people have to walk through with us. I want to always encourage pastors, go get counseling, sit with somebody who can help you, who has the skills and understanding of that. That was a life-saving thing for me to go and get help. And they helped me work through the pain of my life, some of the things that I had not dealt with. And it was amazing as I started to address the pain, the silence I hated that tormented me actually became a really sweet experience. And some of my sweetest times with the Lord, it's a regular practice for me now, is I go and I'm silent. I go on a hike in the woods by myself and I pray and I spend time with the Lord and feel his presence, receive his grace. And it is a life-changing thing to do that, and then enables me to be able to go out and pour out for others, which is what my calling is and what a pastor's calling is. So silence has become one of the sweetest things that I experience now, and I used to hate it.
Brian, I also liked in your book that you said that it's better to have 5 minutes a day than it is to have 30 minutes in one day. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think it's just there's an accumulating factor that we don't give a lot of credit for. I think when we go several days, we may be running on adrenaline, but our soul's kind of dying inside, and we don't know it until so what I deal with a lot of pastors is they contact me when they're at the edge, they're about ready to resign, they're suicidal, their marriage is about to fall apart. That didn't happen overnight. There's an accumulated effect. And I think part of soul care is knowing that we daily have to do something to care for ourselves. And that helps us to be able to continue on. We all know this. We all can sleep 3 or 4 hours a couple of nights and just keep going, but we all crash eventually from that. And it's really ugly when it happens. And so versus getting 7 or 8 hours each night and keep plugging away, I think the same principle is there. You have to give yourself. I have found personally just giving myself a little bit of time to acknowledge, okay, I need to take a breath. I need to check in with the Lord. I just need to just taking a moment in the middle of a busy day, that just can do a lot. 30 minutes in one day does not make up for the accumulation of not doing it for several days, I have found.
Well, so you just listen to what you're describing. You're almost describing like a daily Sabbath, and this isn't replacing someone's quiet time. You're not talking about your devotional life,
Right.
hopefully, possibly early morning. For some people, it's going to be late night. This is a time in the day when you're cease striving and know that I'm God. You're stopping, and so Brian, and then the last one you mentioned that I'll mention in a second. My personal burnout story led me to a genuine burnout. That everything you've described, I experienced. I still have an image of myself sitting on the steps in our home, the steps that went from downstairs up to a bonus room, and just sitting there weeping. And my Connie, my poor wife, such a supportive wife, had no idea what to do with me or how to help me, and yet that just went on day after day after day. And the ministry that I was in, there was no way I could stop working and address the burnout. So I had to figure out, by the grace of God, how do I address it and keep working and keep doing the role of a pastor. There were three things that God put in my life through that time that were survival skills. And one of those was a daily silence and solitude. And for me, that took place about 15 or 20 minutes every day. At the end of the day, I would go to a veteran cemetery near where I live, between the church where I served and our home. It was a very orderly place. The lawn was well manicured. In the summer, spring, and fall, it was nice. And I'd sit there for 15 or 20 minutes, usually have a cup of coffee, and just sit on a bench, and then get up and go home. And so now I don't have the veteran cemetery with me, so I carry a lawn chair in my car every day, and I can find a place to find 10 or 15 minutes to pull over somewhere and sit. It's just refreshing. But the second one that I discovered, that is the last of the six that you mentioned, was that I needed a weekly day off. I needed one day every week that the work just stopped and I didn't touch it. So touch on the subject of rest for a moment, not just on the day off, but also the vacation time that you mentioned.
Yeah. So one of the things I want to stress is when we're talking about these even little gaps of just taking a break and resting every day, and having a day off each week, we need to strategically choose when that is. We can kind of get in the habit of just doing a day off and not doing things that are life-giving and helping us rest. So you can go through the motions of that as a pastor and still not accomplish what we need to accomplish. So Monday mornings, for me, my day off was Fridays for a long time when my kids were little, but it's shifted to Mondays. And one of the reasons is Sunday, as we all know, as pastors, like I'm fried Monday, I call it the preaching hangover on Monday morning, is because it's just a real thing. And it's not just the preaching pouring out. That's part of it. It's just being bombarded with your people all day about things. So Monday mornings, I actually don't plan anything before lunchtime with any people. I don't do emails. I actually go on a hike in the woods every Monday morning. Before the pandemic, that was my normal routine. So choose strategically when you rest during the week is one of the things I would emphasize. The other thing is that I had a dear friend of mine years ago lovingly confront me when he heard that I wasn't taking all the vacation time that my church gave me. And of course, it's tied to my story in the early years. Every time I went on vacation, someone tried to fire me, so I stopped going on vacation. But when all that passed, I wasn't taking vacation time like I should. And my friend, he gave a really strong argument. He said three things. He said, take every day of vacation your church gives you, every day. And he said, one, it's for you. Whether you think you need to rest or not, you need to just take the time and go rest. You don't wait till you're about to fall apart and realize you need rest before you take it. So take it for you. He said, take it for your family. This was really impactful. He said, your family it's the only time, your vacation time is the only time your family does not have to share you with somebody. And that really convicted me when he said that. I'm like, yeah, you're right. That's true. That's the only time. I'm robbing them of more time that they don't have to share me with the church. The third one was also really strong, and that's that it's for the church. I love talking to pastors. I mean, being sarcastic now, I love talking to pastors who, they go pastor a church that's been around for 100 years. And then they think it's going to fall apart and disintegrate when they go on vacation for 2 weeks. And I'm just like, look, I mean, just that's not going to happen. It kind of becomes this running joke, even as you're talking about it. So the church, everything may not go just right, but you need to leave and take everyday vacation so that the church is forced to step up. Other leaders are forced to step up. If nobody steps up, guess what? Somebody might in the vacuum. You may see where you really need to raise up leaders for that. But the point is there's good things that happen, even if there's a couple of Sundays where things don't go real well at church. It still doesn't mean you don't need to take the time that you need to take for the church. So that was a strong argument. Ever since then, I've been working hard to take every day of vacation. I'm unapologetic about it with the church. And it actually has become where I take every year now, I take the month of July off. I just vanish. And the church knows that's coming. And I have actually trained our church through the years, by God's grace, and our church shows how great our people are. This past July, last year when I took the month of July off, in a whole month, I literally did not get one email from one church member the whole entire month. So that's a church that, one, loves me and recognizes, okay, I need to rest. And two, it's years of training them to honor the fact that if you want me to come back and be in any position to be able to love and care for you, you need to let me do this.
Brian, that's super helpful. We thank you for taking this time with us today. And if folks want to talk to you, they can reach you through Practical Shepherding. Practical Shepherding is easy enough to look up online. Type it in, and it'll show up about the ministry, about how to contact Brian. His books are super helpful. We've talked a little bit today about the pastor's soul, the call and care of an under shepherd. And so, man, I want to just thank you for your transparency, your vulnerability, your candor over some of these issues, and listening to your story and having known you for a good while. It makes perfect sense to me that God has used these difficult experiences in your life for your own sanctification, but also to build a platform for the ministry that you have. So I hope that if there are pastors that are listening who are in a difficult spot or a tough place, that they would know that God's doing something in that difficult spot and tough place that they probably can't fully appreciate or understand right now. Thank you for your time and for joining us today.
Todd, I appreciate you and what you're doing. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
I'd like to pray for you as we wrap up.
Thank you.
All right. Dear Lord, thank you for Brian, and thank you for getting to hear his story, and thank you, Lord, for how you've shaped him into the minister that you're using to help a lot of other pastors. Father, I pray your blessings on Auburndale Baptist Church, that you'd provide for everything they have need of, for their members, that you'd protect them from this sickness that we're experiencing right now, and for Brian and others that help him, that they would know how to serve the church during this time. I pray for the ministry of practical shepherding, that you would use him to strengthen pastors, dear Lord, as he teaches other leaders some of these basic ministry skills of hospital visitation and praying for the flock and caring for widows and performing funerals and weddings, that you would just use him, and that you give him favor with those that he trains. And then we pray together for Kentucky Baptist pastors. Pray for every single one of them, dear God, that they would experience your presence and your power, that each of them would know how to care for themselves with the disciplines that you call us to, with the resources that you make available, and that we would encourage each other, dear God, to make sure that as pastors are caring for the flock, that they're and caring for their family, that they're also caring for themselves. We pray thanking you today in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.